Good morning, everyone. My name is Amos Toh, and I am a fellow at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and I also work with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression. UN Special Rapporteurs are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council to monitor and report on human rights issues around the world. The right to freedom of opinion and expression is a well-established human right under international law, as well as in virtually every national constitution around the world. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone shall have the right to freedom of opinion and expression, which includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. When we think about violations of the right to freedom of expression, we might think of charges of defamation and sedition against journalists, government critics, and the media. We might think of censorship of government news websites, journalists. We might think of internet shutdowns, and we might even think of social media censorship. We might focus less on the right to receive information from government authorities and the right to know what is going on behind closed doors with regards to public affairs and government activities. But I'm here to argue that the right to access to information is a key component of freedom of expression. Without access to information, there can be no right to criticize, report, or protest. This is because if we don't know what's going on behind closed doors when government institutions are operating, or how institutions of power are functioning, then secrecy can be weaponized to silence criticism, journalism, and protest. My home country, Singapore, is ranked 151st out of 180 countries on the World Press Freedom Index, which is compiled by the civil society organization Reporters Without Borders. But Singapore is, by many accounts, a peaceful country. There is very little record of any violence against journalists and even its harshest critics. There are no arbitrary executions, no show trials, no sudden disappearances. But repression doesn't have to be overt. It can be invisible, orchestrated in the shadows. Its effects can be deeply felt, but its root causes uncertain. Kirsten Han is a well-established human rights advocate and journalist in Singapore. Her reportings and writings have been featured in publications and news outlets as diverse as Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and ABC News. Her reporting and writings and analysis have raised probing critiques of the Singapore government as well as its laws and policies. In 2016, her husband, who is not Singaporean but had a job offer in Singapore, was told by the Ministry of Manpower that he was not being granted permission to work in Singapore. Although this process of going through the application materials and arriving at the decision and notification on approval to work usually takes 7 days, it took the ministry 2 months to get back to him with its decision not to proceed with his employment pass. This doesn't make any sense on paper. Mr. Han's husband is highly qualified and had a job offer from a large multinational corporation. All the paperwork seemed to have been filled out correctly, and every rule on the book seemed to have been followed. When they asked the ministry for an explanation, this was the response they got, and I'm going to read you an excerpt from the email response they got. We would like to reiterate that each work pass is assessed on its own merit in consultation with the relevant government agencies. We are unable to disclose details of the rejection. Not a lot of information there. So they followed up with some questions, and this was the response that they received again. Our position on this application has not changed. We regret that we are unable to assist any further in your inquiries. This means that Ms. Han's husband can remain in Singapore on visit passes, but he cannot work. Visit passes must be renewed every 6 months. The company that offered him a job had to find someone else. Till this day, Ms. Han and her husband can't make sense of these rejections. She wonders whether it has anything to do with her writings on Singapore, whether it has anything to do with her advocacy against the death penalty in the country and her advocacy and reporting on the state of human rights in Singapore. Ms. Han's predicament is not an isolated incident. Tan Tan Hao, who is a renowned Singaporean playwright, has blogged about how in the last 3 or 4 years, a growing number of educators, teachers, academics, and researchers have found that they have been let go from their positions at work, told that their services are no longer needed, their employment passes denied, their job offers mysteriously withdrawn. What they all have in common with Ms. Han is that they are all, to some degree or another, active participants in public discourse in Singapore. The question is, are they experiencing reprisals as a result of their critiques of the government? Like Ms. Han, they have their suspicions, but they cannot know for sure. And this suspicion, this seed of doubt that cannot be confirmed, is precisely the point. Censorship doesn't just happen when a critic is thrown into jail, or when a media outlet is shut down, or when somebody is charged and convicted of sedition or defamation. The mere prospect of state-sanctioned backlash for something you say that doesn't quite toe the line of acceptable politics, that mere prospect is enough to intimidate or censor. It makes you think twice before you speak. What jobs am I putting on the line? What relationships might suffer as a result of my expression? This is what Ms. Han calls the silhouette of oppression. And this is where access to information comes in. Access to information is a powerful antidote to the silhouette of oppression because it brings government repression or oppression out of the shadows. It prevents government agencies and their deliberations from becoming black boxes. It is well accepted under human rights law that states have an obligation to protect the right to freedom of information under the law. So this usually comes in the form of freedom of information legislation, such as the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. But the Special Rapporteur has observed that having laws is not enough. There must be a transformation of political and bureaucratic culture based on fundamental values of transparency and public participation. There must be an independent legal profession, and there must also be an independent and impartial judiciary. Institutions that can project coercive power, such as law enforcement and intelligence agencies, must be perpetually willing to confront their propensity for violence and intimidation. Taken together, this is what the Special Rapporteur has called the basic infrastructure of protection for access to information. So that is what happens, that's what's required for a regular culture of access to information. But what if that culture doesn't work? What if the proper legal channels and the proper channels for ensuring the flow of information between the people and the government break down? Sometimes government agencies are so steeped in a culture of secrecy that there can be no information out there about what that particular agency does, and there can be very little accountability. Courts exercise very powerful oversight and accountability functions, but they cannot exercise such functions in the dark. The media cannot focus public scrutiny on what it cannot see. In these situations, our last line of defense are the brave individuals that come forward and break the walls of official secrecy and silence so that we, the people, can hold power to account. These individuals are commonly referred to as whistleblowers, and they are important actors in facilitating the right to access to information. In the United States, one of the most prolific whistleblowers in recent memory is Edward Snowden, who was a former contractor with the National Security Agency, the key intelligence agency in the United States. His disclosures of NSA documents revealed to us that both the United States as well as major global powers around the world are conducting mass surveillance operations around the world. Snowden not only encouraged a much-needed conversation about how our privacy should be protected online, he also provided a glimpse into the complex array of public and private actors that mine and collect information about our digital lives and uses that data to project influence and control over global and domestic politics, as well as international economic relations. Mr. Snowden belongs to a long tradition of whistleblowers that have provided opportunities for the rest of us to speak truth to power. But many of these whistleblowers do not have the same profile as Mr. Snowden. Many of them struggle to make their concerns heard. They also face tremendous personal and professional risks, like Mr. Snowden. Take, for example, a former Australian intelligence officer as well as his lawyer, Mr. Bernard Collery. They are currently being charged for allegedly disclosing intelligence secrets in Australia. What was their offense, you might ask? In 2006, their disclosures or alleged disclosures had apparently revealed that the Australian government had planted bugs in government buildings in Timor-Leste while they were negotiating a deal to carve out oil and gas reserves worth billions of dollars. This information of the covert surveillance operation conducted by a foreign power in Timor-Leste not only cast doubt on the validity of the initial agreement that was reached, but it also raises very serious human rights concerns. For these alleged disclosures, they are now being charged with crime. Another whistleblower that has faced tremendous personal and professional risk is Chelsea Manning, who leaked military and diplomatic documents from the United States showing the horrific toll of US war in Afghanistan and Iraq. For her disclosures, she was sentenced to 37 years in prison. Former President Obama commuted her sentence after she had served for 7 years. Treating whistleblowers as criminals doesn't just hurt them, it also hurts us, the public. Without these disclosures, we will not necessarily have the information that is required for us to have candid conversations about the leaders we want to elect, about the kind of society we want to live in, about the democracy that we want to cultivate. It is true that whistleblowing is messy, complex, and contested. Whistleblowers have been accused of making disclosures for personal gain, making too many disclosures, or even sometimes too little, or for placing the safety and security of others at risk. But these arguments are not a bar against whistleblowing. Instead, they simply illustrate that when we enact protections for whistleblowers, when we enact protections for the public's right to know, we must take into account legitimate interests for protecting information. In this spirit, the Special Rapporteur has advocated for protections to be enshrined in law for whistleblowers, especially when they have a reasonable belief at the time of those disclosures that the information that they are disclosing is constituting evidence of harm to the public interest. This would encompass evidence of government corruption, human rights abuses, harm to the environment, and government fraud, waste, or abuse. I hope I have shown you today that information is power and power demands accountability. Access to information is not just a critical component of the right to freedom of expression. It is also a fundamental principle of the rule of law and the backbone of democratic culture. When the regular culture of access to information fails, when routine legal safeguards protecting access to information fails, then we must step forward and protect the individuals that break the walls of silence. Thank you for listening to me today.